Vive la République! Et vive la France!
French President Emmanuel Macron wins a second term. What does it mean for Europe and beyond? Hello, I'm Arnold Knight, and this is The Heat. Emmanuel Macron's decisive victory over the far-right challenger Marine Le Pen was greeted with relief in the West. At stake was the economic and strategic alliance against Russia over the conflict in Ukraine. Macron became the first French president since 2002 to win a second term. But it's also exposed a divided electorate ahead of June's parliamentary elections. Ryan Thompson has more in this report from Paris.
Vive la République!
Emmanuel Macron has further marked his place in French history. The 44-year-old has been re-elected, reversing a 20-year streak of incumbent French presidents unable or unwilling to make it to a second term.
After 5 years of transformation, of happy and difficult hours, of exceptional crisis too, on this day of April 24th, 2022, a majority of us have made the choice to trust me to provide over our republic for the next 5 years.
The incumbent centrist, whose political force has all but destroyed traditional parties in France, celebrated with supporters in the shadow of the Eiffel Tower. Despite several crises, including the COVID pandemic and economic downturns during his tenure, many told us they feel as hopeful as 5 years ago.
I love him. I love this president, and I'm so happy, I'm so happy.
I'm relieved because this is a project first for France, for Europe, for our republic. We believe in his project, and during the next 5 years we're going to rebuild back better.
But as celebrations faded and the nation woke up the morning after, it's clear that France is still politically divided. Macron's movement was called a miracle in 2017, but looking at newspaper headlines this time around, it's a very different story. La Croix notes that there's still a lot of work to do, and nearly every newspaper has taken note of a record support for the far-right national rally. Marine Le Pen improved her 2017 result and assured supporters that was a victory in itself. She's promised to remain prominent in politics and oppose the president during his second term.
I will continue my commitment to France and the French people with the energy, perseverance and affection that I'm known for.
The nation's attention now turns to legislative elections, which will send voters back to the polls in 2 months' time. Macron's Centre Party is likely to lose its majority, with left and right parties now considering what were once unlikely coalitions. Ryan Thompson, CGTN, Paris.
There is much to talk about. Let's get to our panel. Remi Piet is co-founder and managing partner with the consulting firm Embellie Advisory. He joins us from Miami. Song Shin served as the EU-China Relations Advisor for the European Parliament. She's currently a global affairs consultant with Joe and Masters Consulting. And Joav Toker focuses on European affairs as an associate professor at the American Graduate School in Paris. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Joav Toker, let me start with you. Emmanuel Macron, he was comfortably re-elected president of France, defeating Marine Le Pen by 17 points. What do you make of it? What do you make of the margin of victory? It was relatively big. And to what do you attribute Macron's victory?
Right enough, when you look at it arithmetically, you find 17.5 points. That seems large, that seems big. But this is not the political interpretation and shouldn't be the way one should read that. We're speaking about a point in history, and not only electoral history, in which the extreme right as a political force in France has crossed the so-called barrier, so to speak, of 40%. In a face-to-face confrontation of the second round of the presidential election. And we have seen, this is a process which is going on for 20 years for sure, probably 30, 40 years. And this is a peak moment. If you keep going like that arithmetically, next time on, the extreme right, at least according to this kind of dynamics, might very well come to power. Now, I don't want to get into different hypotheses, especially not today, as to what happens to France, or what happens to Europe, or what happens to the Western world if an extreme right party is at the Élysée Palace. What does it mean to NATO? What does it mean to the EU? What does it mean to the overall self-perception of the West? Because the danger is behind us. But still, it means that so many things on the French agenda should be addressed, and quickly so, if we do not want to get to the next point in time, 5 years from now, normally, in which this kind of confrontation may take place and might get different results.
Remi Piet, Joav Toker makes a key point there, the fact that Marine Le Pen has cracked the 40% mark. 4 in 10 French voters voted for her. What did you make of that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a bittersweet victory for Emmanuel Macron, because actually the result for the far right actually can be claimed as a victory for themselves also. I mean, if you actually compare historically with what her father was able to do against Jacques Chirac, it's much more than it used to be the case. It's 13 million people that actually voted Front National. So that really makes her a leading figure of the opposition. Now, it is a result also of her capacity since over the last 5 years of trying to downplay her image of a far-right leader, extremist leader, and really try to have a campaign of people showcasing her cats, being very close to the everyday needs of citizens. And in terms of looking at the future, that makes her a driving force, especially at a time when traditional parties, the Socialist Party on the left, on the side, the Republican Party on the right side of politics, really crumble at very disappointing results. So she's actually leading the front at the opposition right now.
Yeah, Remi, if we look at the first round and the second round, I mean, there was strong support for populists at either end of the political spectrum. In fact, the Financial Times had a piece today in which they say that Macron's victory, and I'm quoting here, it says his victory disguises the reality that the nationalist, Eurosceptic, anti-immigration far right is stronger than at any time since the Second World War. French society remains deeply divided. It was something that was recognized by Macron himself. This is what he said after the election results were known. Let's listen to what he had to say.
We have so much to do, and the war in Ukraine is a reminder that we are going through tragic times when France must speak out, show the clarity of its choices, and build its strength in all areas, and we will do so. We will also need, my friends, to be kind and respectful, because our country is full of many doubts, so many divisions, so we will need to be strong, but no one will be left behind. An answer must be found to the anger and disagreements that led many of our compatriots to vote for the extreme right. It will be my responsibility and that of those around me.
So, Remi, the challenge, it seems, for Emmanuel Macron is to rally those people who did not support him, people at the extreme ends. Can he do that?
Well, to a certain level, he was able to do so between the two rounds of the elections, because some of the people voting far left actually have rallied against Marine Le Pen. She actually won by very close to 60%. So it shows a real capacity to go beyond his immediate party limits. Now the question is going to be for the next elections. We have, Congress elections in two months. It's quite questionable whether he's able to have further elections.
My apologies, we seem to have lost Remi Piet there. Let me go to Songshin. Songshin, you were an advisor to the European Parliament on EU-China relations. How do you see the outcome of this election, and do you expect any major changes in policy direction?
First, thanks for having me. I would like to come back to that previous question first. I think Macron actually failed to eradicate the extremes during his first term, as he promised in 2017. So he really needs to work on that during the second term, because despite his victory at national level, socialists and Republicans are still playing a dominant role at legislative elections, and especially at regional level. So if you look at, if he fails again to cope with it during his second term, Le Pen might be even closer to the power in 2027. And another biggest challenge that Macron is facing is how to actually fix the broken trust relationship between French citizens and the politics in general. Because if we look at the final result, especially the abstention rate, we can see that the French democracy is actually facing some big social challenges here. So the huge frustration about the lack of democratic choice is actually running very deep here. With the central left and central right parties decimated, Macron established himself as the only viable option. And there are actually more people who abstained, roughly around 13.3 million, than the people who voted actually for Le Pen, roughly 13.2 million, I think. So there is a disillusion vis-a-vis politics in France in general. So especially among young people, in the age group from 18 to 24 and 24 to 30, more than 40% of them chose not to vote. And that is a very, very huge challenge for if this continues, this trend. About the EU-China or France-China relationship, I would say Macron's victory will somehow stabilize the bilateral relationship between the two countries and the two blocs at large. We all know the war in Ukraine has accelerated the change of narrative on EU-China relationship. Yeah. Right now, China is seen not only as a systematic rival, but also as a potential threat to the West. We have seen the EU-China summit ended up somehow without any concrete result. Both sides were very frustrated. So far, Macron has been playing very constructive role in balancing EU's stance towards China. Macron has a rather pragmatic and realistic approach to China. Right. Maybe he inherited this from Charles de Gaulle, who decided even to be the first Western country to establish the diplomatic relations with China. So compared to von der Leyen, who has been opposing China and Russia to the West, Macron is one of the few Western politicians who haven't really urged China to pick a side. As Macron pointed out before at a summit in Brussels, it is better to have a China with a neutral position rather than a clear pro-Russian position, which could lead to some further escalation of the war. Of course, we cannot expect that with Macron's re-election, the narrative on EU-China relations can be totally reversed. Yeah. Nevertheless, it would somehow prevent Brussels from seeing this bilateral relationship only through an antagonistic point of view.
Okay, Joav, Toker, I want to get back to something that Remi Piet was talking about before we unfortunately lost him, and that was, I mean, we see Emmanuel Macron, he is the winner, but he will have to deal with a legislative assembly where he does not have a majority. Elections, of course, are scheduled for this coming June. Here's one of the opposition candidates for that assembly talking. Let's listen to him.
Marine Le Pen has reached a historic score of 43%. We find ourselves in a position to be the first opposition in France in the legislative elections, and this is our next objective. The Macron does not have a majority in the National Assembly. A cohabitation seems to be necessary for the survival of France and the French.
So, Joav, we know that the Élysée Palace has a lot of autonomy when it comes to foreign policy, when it comes to defense policy, but is Emmanuel Macron going to have his way as he used to with an opposition in the Legislative Assembly?
Attention, when we try to project what is going to happen in about 2 months, we are not sure that Macron is not going to have a majority in Parliament. He may have, or he may have not. We just don't know. This is precisely what the 2 rounds of the parliamentary elections on June 12 and 19 will decide upon. Now, the French system has this rather peculiar and original balance of power between the executive, the president, and the government, which needs a majority in parliament, which makes it practically impossible for a president to work out his own program and his own agenda if he does not have a majority in parliament. However, constitutionally and even practically, this could happen. This actually did happen 3 times over the recent generation in France, in which there was a president at the Élysée Palace, and he is the chief of the military forces. He is the #1 personality when it comes to foreign affairs and international treaties. And there is a prime minister who's actually on the other side of the political arena, grosso modo, and he or she runs the current affairs of the government, and then the two have to enter sort of a daily negotiating process in which some kind of balance can be true. France has gone through periods like that, but we're not yet there. If indeed the elections in June do not produce a majority which is comfortable for Macron, we may enter this kind of configuration, but it is something that French precedents had gone through. I personally do not think that this is the most likely probability. Most cases show us that a winning president and a winning president with sharp political maelstrom capabilities will get his way, will get a majority in parliament due to combinations, to alliances, to launching new programs, new hopes. And this could very well be the case of Macron in about 2 months from now.
But I'm wondering, in those upcoming elections, Joav, whether this time it could be different, because a number of people who were polled during the election over the past weekend said that they actually didn't vote for Macron, but they were voting against Marine Le Pen. And we also know that there was a very low rate of turnout. So will those people be coming out and voting against Macron in the legislative elections?
To some extent, they may. But once again, here comes the particular, enters the picture in order to understand it, the particularities of the French system. Over the voting yesterday, which actually decided upon the next president for the coming 5 years, the battle, if you wish, the electoral battle was simple. There were 2 individuals, 2 politicians, and the one who got more votes is the coming president, the re-elected president in this case. When it comes to the parliamentary elections in June, the system is very different. We actually have not one single political battle, but we have 577 local political battles in different areas of France on a smaller scale. And in each town or regional zone where one deputy of parliament, one member of parliament is fighting one competitor or 15 different competitors. We have different political combinations, and there is the game of alliances and all kind of political tricks, in the good sense and the bad sense, which make the prediction much more complicated, but which also opens up many different possibilities that you cannot have in a face-to-face. So amongst them, indeed, could be this tactical vote in which someone does not vote for a candidate he/she prefers, or just in order to block the road to the opponent.
Songshin, very quickly, I've only got less than a minute left. You know, Macron has become Europe's de facto leader. That's ever since Angela Merkel of Germany departed from the political scene. And Macron has used that position. He's tried to use that position, for instance, to try and broker a peace deal in the Ukraine conflict. And I'm wondering, what do you think would happen in the future? Do you see him using that position that he's assumed to try and drive European foreign policy in a certain direction?
Well, as European Parliament's president, actually Roberto Metsola pointed out, so Macron's victory confirms like an ambition for an Europe that gives itself the means to act, because just like for EU, just like with the, for example, climate policy, the choice could not have been more black and white when it comes to the EU between Macron and Le Pen, because Le Pen's proposal to turn the EU into a League of Nations would have meant that de facto end of the Union.
Right.
But Macron, on the other hand, has called for bold reform to strengthen the bloc, including by boosting actually EU's own resources, its democratic accountabilities, and allowing those countries that want to integrate further to move faster.
I'm sorry, Song, I've got to interrupt you there. We have run out of time. Thanks to all of you for being with us on the show. Let's turn now to Andrey Kortunov. He served as the head of the Russia International Affairs Council, a Moscow-based think tank, for more than a decade. We spoke earlier about the French election and the Ukraine conflict. Andrey Kortunov, thanks for joining us.
Welcome.
Emmanuel Macron has won re-election in France. He is a staunch supporter of NATO. He's also a member of the European Union, and France, of course, is the only European Union member of the UN Security Council. From a Russian point of view, how significant is his victory?
Well, I guess that his victory suggests that we will see more continuity than change in the French policy towards Russia. And Macron, of course, stands for EU sanctions against Russia. He condemns the Russian operation in Ukraine, but at the same time, Macron is one of the most persistent advocates of keeping the dialogue with Moscow open. And he is one of a few European leaders who regularly calls Putin and has conversations with the Russian leader. So this is something which is likely to continue in future. I'm not too optimistic about the Russian-French relations, but definitely France has never been the most persistent critic of Moscow, and it is not likely to be such a critic in future.
Would Russia have preferred a victory for Marine Le Pen, because she has expressed support for Russia and for President Putin as well? She, in fact, wants to dilute French membership of NATO as well as the European Union, and has rejected sanctions against Russia.
Well, let's face it, Russia is toxic right now in France. So if you followed the campaign of Madame Le Pen, especially the later stages of this election campaign, she tried hard to distance herself from Putin. So I think that if she were to be elected, probably the implications would affect relations between France and the European Union rather than between France and Russia. But we have what we have, and I think a lot will depend right now on the outcome of the elections to the French Parliament, because that would clarify the balance of powers in the French politics, and that might have an impact on the French foreign policy, including its policy towards Moscow.
Would it still have much of an impact, given that traditionally French presidents have pretty much been able to conduct foreign policy as well as defense policy from the Élysée Palace?
Well, that's arguably right, but I think that the danger is that Macron, especially now, when his victory was not as convincing as his first victory back in 2017, might turn out to be a relatively weak political leader. So he will have to forge coalitions, he will be forced to make compromises, and he might depend on the government more than he used to.
Back in 2019, you wrote a piece in the Moscow Times, and you said in that piece that Macron and Putin may differ on fundamental issues like human rights and the future of the world order, but you did write, you said they need each other. And I'm quoting you here now, you said, right now, Putin simply does not have a more suitable negotiating partner in Europe than Macron. Of course, much has happened since then, but do you still believe that to be the case?
Well, I think it's still the case, even more so with Angela Merkel out of office right now, with the United Kingdom out of the European Union, with all the problems that they experience in Italy. I think that France and Macron remain the natural partners. Of course, it's very difficult right now even to talk about any kind of partnership, but at least they can become interlocutors for the Russian leaders. And now France is also chairing the European Union, which gives France additional weight in European and global politics.
So you feel that they are able to talk to each other, that they could engage in dialogue, and of course, as you pointed out, Macron is a strong advocate for dialogue. That could form the basis of what? Where do you see that going?
Well, I think that there are two levels at which they can interact and two sets of problems that they can discuss. There are certain situational issues like, humanitarian corridors, evacuation of civil population, maybe prisoners exchanges, something which will not change the overall conflict, the logic of the conflict, but might still be helpful in order to reduce human sufferings. But there is also the second level of issues that they can discuss, and that might include modalities of the peace agreements, security guarantees to Ukraine, the neutral status for the Ukrainian state, and the terms of the peace settlement. I am not too optimistic about the second level of conversation. Probably Russia is not yet ripe for such a conversation, but I think that the time will come when they get down to this agenda as well.
And I'm wondering if the Western side is ripe for such a conversation, because, you could have a dialogue between Emmanuel Macron and Vladimir Putin, but it doesn't seem like the most important and most powerful member of NATO, the United States, is ready for dialogue of any kind. We've just had the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, and the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, in Kyiv. They've been visiting Ukraine, and in fact, the Secretary of Defense said the goal of the United States right now is to weaken Russia militarily.
Well, I think that a lot will be defined by the situation on the battlefield. If the perception is that Russia is losing, that Russians have to retreat, then there is no need to have a dialogue with Moscow. However, if the Russian offensive continues, if the balance of powers is changing in favor of the Kremlin, then that might incentivize Joe Biden and his team to reconsider their current position. So we will have to wait and to see what happens.
The United Nations Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, he's also getting involved in kinds of peace efforts. What hope do you hold that he might be able to make some progress?
Well, I try to be optimistic, but I don't see too many grounds to be optimistic. I think that they can discuss humanitarian issues as well, and probably they can reach some positive results in such a discussion. But I don't think that we will see a breakthrough. I don't think that Secretary General of the United Nations is able to change the narrative of the Russian leadership or the narrative of the Ukrainian leadership.
Andrey Kortunov, thanks for joining us. Of course, we will have much more on the situation in Ukraine from you in our show tomorrow. Thanks for joining us. And that's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.
The world economy as we know it is about to change. Global business reports highlight emerging markets, developing countries, and dynamic sectors worldwide. We feature top analysts and newsmakers to provide perspectives on every facet of business. From an on-the-ground perspective, we provide you with balanced and objective assessments. Fast, sharp, and insightful. Global business. Only on CGTN.